Good morning, everyone. Our lecture for today is Discourse Analysis and Language Teaching. And because of the length of the lecture, I'm going to make it 2 videos. So now we will start with the first video. Discourse Analysis and Language Teaching. Like other branches of linguistics, language teaching has until recently been concerned with grammatical rather than communicative competence. So one of the writers, Wilkins, 1972, observes that although there have been major changes in the methodology of language teaching over the years, the underlying principle has remained the same. He quotes by saying, "It has been assumed that units of learning should be defined in grammatical terms, although the precise sequence in which they occurred would be influenced by pedagogic consideration." Finish the quotation. Further, he suggests that even those courses which encourage dialogue and improvised drama are structured grammatically, and the situation that are created are pedagogic, bearing little resemblance to natural language use. The communicative approach to language teaching, which began in the early 1970s and gradually took over most of language teaching in the world, has made people aware of the need to focus on communicative features of language use as an integral part of the teaching program. It is widely accepted in the field that we teach both language for communication and language as communication. In other words, the objective of language teaching is for the teachers to be able to communicate by using the target language, even if at times this is limited communication. And the most effective way to teach language is by using it for communication. So, given this premise, the goal of language teaching is to enable the learner to communicate, and the method for teaching is for the learner to experience and practice relevant instances of communication. It would be ill-advised to teach language via the communicative approach without relying heavily on discourse analysis. This is wrong. In fact, discourse analysis should provide the main frame of reference for decision-making in language teaching and learning. Creating suitable context for interaction, illustrating speaker-hearer and reader-writer exchanges, and providing learners with opportunities to process language within a variety of situations are all necessary for developing learning environment where language acquisition and language development can take place within a communicative perspective. Discourse analysis and pragmatics are relevant to language teaching and language learning, of course, since they represent 2 related discourse words that characterize human communication. The first represent intended meaning transmitted within context and is therefore concerned with sequential relationships in prediction. And the other explains the interpreted meaning resulting from linguistic processing and social interaction, all the while taking into account a variety of contextual factors. Contextual factors, pay attention to this, at the receptive end. Language teaching needs to focus on both strategies of message construction to facilitate learner production of the communicative intent and strategies of interpretation in order to ensure some ability on the learner's part to process and financially even if approximately the speaker writer's intent. For many years, during the first half of the 20th century and well into the second half, language teaching, like linguistics, used the sentence as its basic unit of analysis. In language teaching, this meant that rules, examples, exercises, and activities focused on individual sentences. Consequently, this was an approach which legitimized decontextualized language practice. Individual sentences can be interesting, unusual, or mysterious, but when separated from context, they lack real meaning. Generations of learners practiced sentences in the target language and remained quite incapable of linking these sentences into meaningful stretches of discourse. So they can, for example, know these sentences and know their meaning, but they keep incapable of linking these sentences into a unified whole text. In the more recent approaches to language learning and teaching, discourse or text has become the basic unit of analysis. More recent language textbooks present text, short or long, as a basis for both understanding and practicing language use within larger, meaningful contexts. This approach has greatly altered the type of activities undertaken in language classroom. So learners in this case need to focus, therefore, on various discourse features with any specified language activities. Another perspective that was added to language materials and classroom activities is the set of sociolinguistic features that accompany any natural interaction. The real or imaginary participants involved in a communicative activity in the classroom become important. If the classroom activity is to represent real-life interaction, then age, social status, and other personal characteristics of the interactants cannot be ignored. And learners are expected to develop awareness of the linguistic choices which are related to such features. They need to gain experience in decision making related to choices of linguistic representation that are compatible with the characteristics of the participant and with the pragmatic features of the given situation. Simulated speech events become an important feature of the language classroom, and although such a simulated speech event is a classroom artifact, it must represent as closely as possible a real speech event that could occur in natural interaction. Prior to adoption of the communicative approach to language teaching, the main goal of the language classroom was to supply students with the ability to produce and recognize linguistically acceptable sentences. The communicative approach added an especially important new dimension: communication strategies. The underlying notion of the approach recognizes the fact that learners may never achieve full linguistic competence, and yet they will need to use the target language for various types of communication, as we did sometimes when we explain a lesson or a lecture to our students. Sometimes we try to convert to our target language to make things clear. So this is what is mentioned here. One needs to develop, therefore, communication strategies that overcome and compensate for the lack of linguistic knowledge. Such communication strategies are partly universal in nature from the learner's point of view, since some can successfully be transferred from the first language. That's why we can name or title this universal. Thus, learners who are good communicators in their first language have a good chance of also becoming effective communicators in their second, although they may not know the second language nearly as well as the first. We are referring here to the ability to paraphrase, use circumlocution and gestures, among other things, during spoken communication. These abilities seem to be quite transferable if the language classroom provides sufficient opportunities for using such strategies in the second language. As a result of the general acceptance of the communicative approach, language learning and language teaching have had to fully incorporate communicative interaction into the curriculum. The fact that language users exhibit linguistic, cultural, and social identities in a real-life interaction affects the teacher's choice of simulated or specially designed classroom interactions, which attempt to recreate the main features of the real-world event within the language classroom. The component language teacher can no longer limit herself or himself to be an educator and a grammarian. To a certain extent, she or he also must be a sociolinguist, aware of and interested in various aspects of discourse analysis. Fortunately, there are several books now available to address this educational leap. Nunnan, for example, in 1993, directs his work at beginning students in discourse analysis, and he addresses language teachers who want to incorporate discourse analysis into their teaching. Nunnan's choice of text helps clarify and deepen the reader's understanding of discourse analysis. So let's have a look to these ideas or thoughts that Nunnan presents to the teachers. Shared knowledge, the basis for planning the teaching, learning continuum. The discourse perspective in language teaching places particular importance on the notion of shared knowledge. The notion relates to one's general knowledge of the word, knowledge to which participants in an interaction can appeal before, during, and after a communicative event. So this notion relates to one's general knowledge of the word. This knowledge to which participants in an interaction can appeal before, during, and after a communicative event. This appeal to or reliance on knowledge of the word is not always conscious, but it always affects the communicative interaction by either easing it along or interfering and even blocking it. The extent to which the participants share such knowledge will therefore affect the degree to which the communicative interaction will be effective. Speakers assume shared knowledge when they address others and plan their utterances. Accordingly, listeners appeal to prior knowledge while interpreting the flow of speech. Well, writers plan their texts according to what they presume their intended audience knows about the word, and readers appeal to their prior knowledge while processing written text. Furthermore, Interactants select or prefer language which accommodates and strengthens some of the shared and mutually perceived situational features. When we misjudge shared knowledge or the perceptions of the other participants in the interaction, we potentially run the risk of creating instances of minor or serious miscommunication. This can happen among speakers of the same language and within the same socio-cultural setting either, but it occurs much more frequently across linguistic and cultural barriers. Social knowledge, shared knowledge, must therefore include both general knowledge of the world and socio-cultural knowledge related to the target speech community whose language the learner is trying to acquire. In the literature about reading and writing, the term prior knowledge plays a very central role. It is the conceptual knowledge that enables interactants to communicate with one another via the written or spoken text. Marr and Gormley, 1982, defined prior knowledge as knowledge about events, persons, and the like, which provides a conceptual framework for interacting with the world. Charlotte, 1982, further expands the notion to refer to everything a person knows, including tacit and explicit knowledge of procedures and typical ways of expressing information. Alexander et al., 1991, developed a conceptual framework of knowledge, including domain and discipline knowledge as part of general content knowledge, and knowledge of text structure, context, and rhetoric as part of one's discourse knowledge. Effective communicative interaction among language users is achieved, therefore, when there is a basic sharing of prior content and discourse knowledge between the producers and the interpreters of the text. There needs to be a matching of three types of background knowledge: prior factual or cultural knowledge, prior work or life experience, and prior familiarity with the relevant discourse community. These are the three. For spoken language, the interlocutors need to be familiar with socio-cultural conventions and interaction management. Considerations of politeness norms, of turn-taking conventions, and of forms of address are important for maintaining social harmony and for personal negotiation. For written language, writers and readers need to share writing conventions, familiarity with genre types, and rhetorical traditions. In formal language teaching, we need to distinguish between adult learners and adolescents or children in school. Adult language learners come not only from a different language background, but also from a different cultural background. And as was mentioned before, this cultural background is very much part of their knowledge of the world. For such adult learners, the modern language classroom needs to take into account cross-cultural differences that might interfere with successful communication in the target language. It is therefore important to plan the language curriculum so as to accommodate communicative interaction that will enable learners to both experience and reflect on cross-cultural differences. When we are concerned with students in school as language learners, we have to take into account another perspective: the student maturational development and their acquisition of word knowledge. A text in the target language brought to class might present content difficulties because of the subject matter, which might not yet be known to the student, or it might be difficult because of cultural information with which they are not familiar. Planning the language curriculum and planning the language lesson have to take into account the need to accommodate the learner's prior knowledge in order to build up the shared knowledge necessary for the learners to interact successfully within the planned communicative event. A discourse perspective on language teaching places significant emphasis on the notion of shared knowledge, since this factor is at the heart of successful interpersonal communication. Classroom pedagogy can no longer limit itself to the linguistic corpus of the target language. It has to expand its activities and planning to include socio-cultural and pragmatic considerations in order to use the language effectively. So in order to use the language effectively, the language user needs to have knowledge of the various factors that impact human communication. A discourse-based model for language pedagogy perceives shared knowledge as consisting of layers of mutually understood subcategories, such as context knowledge, context knowledge, linguistic knowledge, discourse knowledge, etc. Therefore, shared knowledge is of primary importance in modern language pedagogy. Now, the second important factor that Nanan mentions to the teachers is discourse in the language classroom, the basis for creating the context for language learning. If we think of a discourse community as a group of people who share many things, a considerable body of knowledge, a specific group culture, an acceptable code of behavior, a common language, for example, a common physical environment, and perhaps a common goal or interest, they share all these things, we can easily see how the language classroom is a unique discourse community, because people in this group, they share all these things. The students and their teacher make up a group that shares almost all of the factors mentioned above. The factors I mean here, the specific, the common language, the accepted code of behavior, common physical environment, common goal or interest, all these knowledge. They share all this knowledge, the students and their teacher in the classroom. So they communicate, and communication will take place in the target language, even though the teacher and the students could communicate more effectively in their first language. So they communicate in their first language, but if they have shared knowledge of all these aspects, they can easily communicate the target language. Similarly, in any language class that uses the communicative approach, it is known that many of the classroom events and activities are not real in terms of classroom situation, but are used as representations of real situations in the world outside the classroom. So they are not real, but they are represented as if they are real to suit the situation and the situation of the classroom. Swell's 1990 has developed 6 defining characteristics that are necessary and sufficient for identifying a group of people as a discourse community. And here we adapt these to the language classroom. A discourse community has a broadly agreed set of common public goals. The public goal of a language classroom is quite obvious: to promote the students' acquisition of the target language as a group and as individuals in an effective manner as possible. Sometimes certain classes will have other specific goals for a particular period of time, but those specific objectives will usually fall within the more global goal of acquiring the language. A discourse community has mechanisms of intercommunication among its members. So any classroom, the language classroom included, has well-recognized mechanisms for intercommunication. The teacher communicates instructions, knowledge, and guidance to the students in various ways. And the students communicate with the teacher via homework, assignments, group activities, and other educational projects. The students also communicate with one another within the classroom context. Sometimes this is real communication pertinent to the situation, and at other times this is part of the make-believe word that is part of a classroom activity. A discourse community uses its participatory mechanisms primarily to provide information and feedback. The language classroom has unique participatory mechanisms that provide feedback on students' participation in learning activities, feedback on the degree of approximation of their language performance to the target, information to prepare them for subsequent work, etc. Typically, however, within the classroom context, the teacher is in complete control of the initiation of the information and feedback flow, while the students are at the receiving end. In more modern educational context, recently, the students can also become initiators of the information and feedback flow. A discourse community utilizes and hence possesses one or more genres in the communicative furtherance of its aims. According to Bashia, 1993, each genre is an instance of a successful achievement of a specific communicative purpose, using conventionalized knowledge of linguistics and discourse resources. The language classroom has definitely developed and continues to develop expectations for discourse that are compatible with its goals and with the type of activities that go on in the classroom. The instruction and the guidance that teachers direct at their students take on a genre that the students recognize. As part of the interaction, students also learn which genre is appropriate for their linguistic production within various classroom activities. Many features of these genres may be common to all classrooms, and certainly to all language classrooms, since they share common goals and conventions. Yet any particular classroom may also develop its own unique genre, which fits the common goals and preferences of that particular teacher and that particular group of students. In any case, it is obvious that anyone joining a classroom after the start of the school year, for instance, will have to learn specific features of the genre of that class. Number 5. In addition to owning genres, a discourse community has acquired some specific lexemes. Again, this requirement fits the classroom context quite well. A school language has its specific lexemes Language learning has its specific lexes, and a particular classroom may have some of its own lexes. Any teacher, but of course particularly a language teacher, may have his or her own preferred stock of words and phrases, which then become the lexes of the classroom. Sometimes students who act as leaders in the classroom also add their own word and phrases references to the classroom lexes. And finally, a discourse community has a threshold level of members with a suitable degree of relevant content and discursive expertise. With respect to this particular requirement, classrooms have some universal features which are part of any school system. At the beginning of every year, of every school year, only the teacher is normally considered as expert. However, each particular group of students is initiated into the discourse code of their class. In terms of their participation in their discourse community, one could consider each year's new students as novices who will become experts in certain skills and areas by the end of the year. When the language classroom functions as a discourse community, it thereby creates its own context within which the students and the teacher can develop linguistic and cross-cultural discourse practices that further their efforts toward the common goal of improving the students' target language competence and performance. Language teachers and curriculum developers can and should capitalize on the language classroom as a discourse community. Or as Breen 1985 has said, they should exploit the social context of the language classroom more fully, since it reflects what happens in society more generally. One can, for instance, make the distinction between truly authentic interaction that deals with the actual affairs of the class and its members, and the representative material, which becomes real only as part of the group's make-believe contract. And in the teaching learning situation, the truly authentic elements will carry considerable weight, since there is no doubt that these are instances where the students will focus more on the meaning than on the message. In other words, during actual classroom interaction, the student, please pay attention to this, will not always think of the language in which they interact, but rather they focus on the goals of their interaction. This creates authentic communication in the target language and allows students accumulate significant experience in using that language. During the simulated representative interaction, on the other hand, they will need to suspend immediate reality and create represented reality on a make-believe basis. Authentic interactions will further enrich their experience in the target language, leading to more effective acquisition. Furthermore, the fact that a language classroom is part of a school system and that students need to show results or outcomes based on their learning experiences will usually motivate students to engage in reflection and metacognition, which will then facilitate the conscious learning process. This is what I mentioned now. The student should make distinction to truly authentic interaction, which deals with the actual efforts of the class, and the representative material, which becomes real. And during actual classroom interaction, the students will not always think of the language in which they interact, but rather they focus on the goals of their interaction. So during the simulated representative interaction, they will need to suspend immediate reality and create represented reality on a make-believe basis. Now, the fact that a language classroom is part of a school system, please pay attention to this, and that students need to show results or outcomes based on their learning experiences will usually motivate students to engage in reflection and metacognition, which will then facilitate the conscious learning process. A special type of discourse will develop for each of these three different types of interaction. The real interaction between students and teacher, and among the students themselves when dealing with real matters relating to their immediate environment. Instances of practice that are part of the learning curriculum, and instances of reflection which relate to what has been learned and are an attempt to mentally encode the learning experiences for further encounters. Somewhat different discourse rules will develop for each of these sub-discourses. Here we will finish the first half of the lecture. Now I want your feedback. What you learned from this lecture? What are the main ideas that you have got from this lecture? Thanks a lot for your attention and concern.